Mr. President, 13 years later, 10 years after the adoption of the Constitution, may I invite you to come and open the conference. Thank you.
Is that so? Are you playing football? I doubt that. Thank you, program director, wherever he's disappeared to. There he is. And our friend TJNA Mukumba, Executive Director of Tax Justice Network Africa, and the other PAC partners, and Your Excellencies, representatives of governments, members of the Africa Group, members of civil society, academia, and international organizations, and colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's both an honor and pleasure to join you at this 13th Pan-African Conference as we mark 10 years since the publication of the high-level panel report on illicit financial flows from Africa, and together examine ways and means to ensure that Africa has the necessary wherewithal to achieve its sustainable development. When the panel submitted its report in 2015, as Abdallah Hamdok has just said, and as had been the desire of the ECA-AU Ministers of Finance, Economic Planning and Development, when they decided on the establishment of the panel in 2011, as Mojango has said, it made visible what had for too long been hidden, which was a massive hemorrhaging of Africa's resources through the illicit financial flows. The report showed that the IFFs were not an abstract problem, but a very real drain on Africa's capacity to finance its own development, to provide social services, and build the industries and infrastructure necessary for the prosperity of Africa's peoples. And the mere fact of detailing in one document all the principal elements relating to the illicit financial flows, together with the engagement the panel had with various African countries as it prepared its report, accomplished its strategic task of putting at the very center of the consciousness of the broad African leadership the urgent task to combat the illicit financial flows. And thus, the mere knowledge of the reality of the problem created the possibility to lay the basis for action to address the problem. Our panel was therefore very happy that Africa's most senior political leadership, meeting in an African Union Assembly of Heads of State and Government in January 2015, adopted the panel's report, including its recommendations. It was and remains of great importance that this Assembly, African Union Assembly, adopted a special declaration on illicit financial flows. And what the declaration said remains relevant to this day, as for instance, it drew attention to the growing need for domestic resource mobilization for the attainment of our continental development visions and goals. Particularly, it said Agenda 2063 and the Common African Position at the point at that time on the post-2015 development agenda, which both called for inclusive, it said, growth, sustainable development, and social and economic structural transformation of Africa through optimal utilization of our natural resource endowments. In fact, fully understanding the need to act on this matter, the declaration requested the AU Commission, the Economic Commission for Africa, the African Development Bank, the African Capacity Building Foundation, and other development partners to build capacities of the African Union member states and institutions, particularly in contract negotiation, tax management, regulatory and legal frameworks, policies, money laundering, asset recovery and repatriation, and resource governance for effective and optimal management and governance of our natural resources. And correctly, because of the inherently international nature of these illicit financial flows, That declaration also expressed the need to ensure that illicit financial flows and their impact on domestic resource mobilization is given the necessary attention. It was then the forthcoming Third International Conference on Financing for Development. And in this regard, it stressed the need for robust international cooperation to address the problem. Of course, I must also mention that the declaration authorized our panel to work for the implementation of the panel's recommendations, which are now AU policy, bringing on board, in addition to the governments of the AU member states, a broad coalition of partners, including civil society and the private sector. And I hope, Program Director, that the conference will find time to assess how far these important directives have been implemented in order to answer the question, what improvements need to be effected. In this context, I must mention that a notable element of the post-declaration involvement of the panel was that it had the task to report annually to the AU Assembly on the performance of each of the AU member states in terms of the implementation of the AU decisions on the IFFs. The good news in this regard is that the panel did not experience any resistance by any of the African countries when they were approached for such assessments. The sad news is that in practice, the panel has not submitted even one report to the Assembly. Accordingly, there are no reports available about how effectively the AU member states have worked to implement the AU policies on the IFFs, as well as on the related matters of the capacities of the African states in this regard, a matter that I think will be discussed later today. The reason for this very sad piece of news is that, regrettably, the panel ran out of funds to carry out the engagements with the individual African states, despite the keenness of the panel to carry out its work in this regard. However, I'd like to assure the conference that there are efforts currently being pursued which will hopefully end this resource limitation, which made it impossible for the panel actually to engage individual African countries as had been agreed. I must say that some engagement did take place, but it petered out at some point. We must also report that, as was absolutely necessary, our panel engaged the international community to help ensure a coordinated global response to the IFFs. Again, Abdallah has mentioned this. In this connection, I must mention our engagements with the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD, the US government, even the UN ECOSOC. It was important that the 2015 Third International Conference on Financing for Development put the matter of combating the IFFs on its action plan. And this led to the adoption of this position by the UN General Assembly when it adopted the Sustainable Development Goals during the same year. The 2025 Fourth International Conference on Financing for Development has maintained this position on combating the IFFs and confirmed engagement in the negotiations of a United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. It is true that as we engaged on our global outreach, there was a pushback, which I think continues, to the work on highlighting the effect of illicit financial outflows from Africa in the form of a coordinated pushback from some sectors on whether aggressive tax planning and avoidance amounted to IFFs. Happily, this effort has not stopped the adoption of a correct international posture against the international financial flows. Over the past decade, we've seen the agenda we've set begin to bear fruit. For instance, we have seen concrete reforms as beneficial ownership registers, automatic exchange of information, stronger transfer pricing capacity, and measurement capabilities, all of which are tools that help our tax authorities to fight abuse. Yet, despite these advances, the scale of illicit outflows remains staggering. We must acknowledge that while we have succeeded in raising awareness and beginning reforms, we have not yet succeeded in stopping the outflows. However, from a technical perspective, some African countries have strengthened their capacity to engage in complex areas of tax policy. Some of our partner organizations, such as IFFs and TJNA, have played important constructive roles in this regard. But here lies a challenge. And despite Africa's increased technical competence, the outcomes of the global tax reform processes have not delivered the fairness that we seek. The rules are not written in a vacuum. They are shaped by political power. And needless to say, I'd like to emphasize that political leadership is critical to achieve the required change. On the political front, Africa has taken important steps which, among others, culminated in the historic decision of the UN General Assembly in 2022 to begin negotiations towards a UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. And this is no small achievement. For decades, the OECD has dominated global tax rulemaking with limited space for developing countries. It was through political unity, driven by the Africa Group, that the world finally recognized the need for a universal and inclusive forum. And this achievement reflects a central lesson of the past decade, which is that technical expertise must be matched with political mobilization. And only by uniting as a continent and by speaking with one voice can we hope to transform the global rules that so profoundly affect Africa's capacity to mobilize its resources. These negotiations have reached a critical stage that demands active participation from the African countries to shape the Framework Convention and its protocols so that our needs and priorities are fully reflected. At the same time, we must sustain rigorous technical work to regenerate the evidence-based arguments that will strengthen Africa's positions through the negotiation process. As we look to the next decade, three considerations stand out. First is deepening domestic capacity. Even as we fight for fairer international rules, we must strengthen our own tax administrations here at home. And second, there is the linking of the tax to Africa's structural transformation. It is not enough to collect more revenue. We must design tax policies that actively support Africa's industrialization and job creation in the context of the continuing struggle to break out of the neo-colonial economic paradigm. And third, securing Africa's voice in global governance. The negotiations toward the UN Tax Convention will be a defining struggle of the next decade. Together with the Global South, Africa must continue to lead not only to ensure inclusive participation, but to anchor the tax convention in principle of fairness, equity, and development. 10 years ago, the high-level panel declared that Africa could not afford to lose one more dollar through illicit outflows. And 10 years on, we must declare that Africa cannot afford another decade of subordination in the global financial system. If we succeed to defeat this subordination, as we must, then 10 years from now, we will no longer be speaking of resources lost, but of resources retained, mobilized, and deployed to build the Africa we want. The next decade must be one of collaboration, of coming together in spaces like this to share, to learn, and sharpen our collective strategies to curb the international financial flows. My heartfelt thanks go to the TJNA, Tax Justice Network Africa, its partners, and our conveners for organizing this PAC, which embodies exactly the necessary spirit of solidarity and joint action. Together, we are laying the foundation for a future where Africa's wealth works for its people. I thank you for your attention and officially open the 13th Pan-African Conference on IFFs and Taxations, and thank you very much.